The wind, a relentless sculptor, carved the snow into mournful drifts, each crest a frozen wave against an endless white ocean. It whispered ancient sorrows through the skeletal branches of pine and fir, a dirge for a world seemingly abandoned by warmth, by light, by any semblance of mercy. Beneath this vast, indifferent sky, the land lay shrouded, a canvas of desolation stretching to horizons blurred by the ever-falling flakes. Here, where the air itself was a blade, movement ceased, and life clung to the faintest, most stubborn threads. A patch of darkness, stark against the uniform white, lay partially submerged, a stain upon the pristine canvas. It was a woman, or what remained of one, her form a broken contour beneath a dusting of fresh snow. One hand, raw and chapped, lay exposed, fingers curled loosely as if still trying to grasp something lost. Her cloak, once perhaps a vibrant hue, was now tattered and stained, offering little solace against the gnawing cold that sought to claim her. Only the faintest cloud of mist, a fragile exhalation that kissed the frigid air before vanishing, betrayed the spark that yet flickered within. Her name was Elara, though the name itself felt like a distant echo, a word belonging to a life burned to ash. The memory of warmth was a cruel phantom, dancing just beyond the reach of her frost-numbed consciousness. Instead, there was only the bite of the ice, the suffocating weight of the snow, and the dull, pervasive ache that had become her world. Around her, unseen beneath the deepening white, lay the ghosts of what had been. The wind carried no scent of wood smoke from a welcoming hearth, only the faint, lingering char of destruction, a metallic tang that spoke of violence and finality. Images, sharp and searing, sometimes pierced the frozen fog of her mind, flames licking at timbers, the screams of men, the wide, terrified eyes of children, the glint of steel under a smoke-choked moon. Then, oblivion would reclaim her, a merciful darkness that offered a temporary reprieve from the unendurable. How long she had lain there, a discarded remnant of that conflagration, she did not know. Time had become a meaningless concept, measured only in the deepening cold and the slow ebbing of her own fragile pulse. The world was reduced to this patch of frozen ground, this struggle for each stolen breath. Was this, then, the end? A quiet surrender to the numbing embrace of the snow, a final, silent fading into the white. The thought held a strange, weary allure. But something, some primal instinct deeper than despair, kept that faint mist appearing, a stubborn refusal whispered into the uncaring void. Then, a change in the rhythm of the wilderness. Not the wind, nor the scuttling of some unseen creature. A shadow, elongated and lean, fell across the snow near her. It moved with a quiet deliberation, a fluidity that spoke of long acquaintance with such desolate places. The figure paused, a silhouette against the pale light, gaze sweeping the landscape before settling on the dark shape at his feet. He was a man, clad in furs and worn leather, his face weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that told of solitude and survival. Kale. His eyes, the color of winter twilight, held no surprise, only a deep, assessing stillness. He had seen death in many forms in these unforgiving lands. This, however, was death hesitating, life clinging on with an almost defiant fragility. He knelt, his movements economical, disturbing the snow as little as possible. A gloved hand reached out, not towards her, but to test the air, to feel the subtle shifts in the wind. He saw the faint cloud of her breath. He saw the pulse, a barely perceptible flutter at the base of her throat, a tiny bird trapped beneath a drift. For a long moment, he remained motionless, a statue carved from the very ice and stone around him. What was she? A survivor? A witness? A burden? The wilderness was a harsh mistress, demanding all of one's strength simply to exist. To take on another, especially one so close to the edge, was to invite peril. His gaze flickered towards the distant, scorched scar on the horizon, a smudge of ruin almost invisible now under the fresh snowfall. He knew what had happened there. The wind carried tales, even to the most isolated corners. He saw the singed hem of her cloak, the way her body was curled as if to protect something no longer there. His face, usually an impassive mask, softened by an almost imperceptible degree. Perhaps it was a memory of his own losses, a pain buried deep beneath layers of stoicism, or perhaps it was simply the recognition of a shared humanity in the face of overwhelming brutality. The choice hung in the frozen air, heavy and unspoken. leave her to the inevitable peace of the snow, or intervene, and in doing so, tether himself to her fate. He looked at her face, pale and drawn, framed by strands of dark hair matted with ice. There was a ghost of resilience there, a shadow of defiance in the set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and brushed the snow from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle. Then, with a grunt of effort that acknowledged the weight of his decision, he gathered her into his arms. Her body was limp, a fragile weight against his strength. He adjusted her cloak around her, pulling the hood further over her head, shielding her face from the biting wind. He rose, turning his back on the direction of the massacre, and began to walk, his steps sure and steady, leaving a single set of deep tracks in the pristine snow, 2 lives now intertwined, moving away from the ashes and into the vast, uncertain silence of the wilderness. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the frozen crust and the mournful sigh of the wind, now a companion to their desperate, silent journey. The world swam back to Elara in fragments, shards of sensation piercing the merciful void. First, a dull throbbing in her head, then the raw ache of her limbs, a symphony of pain conducting her return to consciousness. There was a pressure against her back, a rhythmic jostling. Above, the sky was a moving canvas of grey, branches like skeletal fingers reaching across it. Fear, cold and familiar, clenched her heart. Where was she? Who carried her? The images of fire and steel returned, sharp and terrifying. She tried to cry out, to struggle, but her body was a leaden weight, her voice a frozen whisper lost in her throat. Then, a different sensation, warmth. Not the searing heat of flames, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones, chasing away the deep chill that had claimed her. It was a confusing, disorienting feeling. She blinked, her eyelids heavy, and saw the rough-hewn timbers of a ceiling, smoke-stained and unfamiliar. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something like herbs, pungent and vaguely medicinal. She lay on a bed of furs, thick and surprisingly soft. A fire crackled nearby, its orange light dancing on the stone walls of what appeared to be a small, crude shelter, perhaps a cave or a deeply recessed overhang, improved by human hands. Her tattered cloak had been removed, replaced by a heavy fur blanket. She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as pain shot through her. A shadow moved at the periphery of her vision. Cale. He sat by the fire, his back to her, tending to a small pot suspended over the flames. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her movement, yet she felt his awareness of her, a silent, watchful presence. Panic-ward with exhaustion. Was he one of them? The ones who had brought ruin to her world? But his presence felt different. There was no menace in his stillness, only a profound quiet. He moved with the patient, deliberate economy of someone long accustomed to solitude and the rhythms of the wild. Elara lay back, her breath shallow. She remembered the snow, the feeling of fading, then the shadow falling over her. He had found her. He had brought her here. Why? Days, or perhaps what felt like days, blurred into a routine of survival, punctuated by Elara's fitful sleep and waking nightmares. When she slept, the massacre replayed itself in vivid, horrifying detail, the suddenness of the attack, the chilling war cries of the raiders, their faces obscured by grime and the frenzy of violence, the smell of blood and burning. She would wake with a choked cry, her heart hammering, the phantom scent of smoke filling her nostrils. Each time, Cale would be there, a steadfast presence in the flickering firelight. He never spoke of what he might have seen or heard from her cries, never questioned her. He would simply offer her a cup of warm broth, its taste earthy and nourishing, or adjust the furs around her. His care was unspoken, delivered through actions. He cleaned her few wounds, applying a poultice of crushed leaves that stung initially but then soothed. He kept the fire alive, a small sun against the persistent gloom. He would leave for long periods, returning with fresh game, a rabbit, a brace of birds, or roots and dried berries he'd managed to forage from the frozen land. Elara watched him, her gaze wary at first, then slowly, infinitesimally, tinged with a reluctant curiosity. He moved like a ghost, his footsteps barely disturbing the packed earth floor of their shelter. He sharpened his knife with a focused intensity, the rhythmic rasp of stone on steel a strangely comforting sound in the vast silence. His hands, though calloused and strong, were deft as he stitched a tear in his own worn tunic or fashioned a snare from sinew and twigs. He was a man of the wilderness, as much a part of it as the ancient stones and the whispering pines. Slowly, the raw edges of Ilara's grief and terror began to soften, not disappearing, but receding enough to allow for the faintest stirring of something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply the animal instinct to trust the hand that offered sustenance and warmth. She started to notice the small details, the way he would pause before stepping out of the shelter, his head tilted, listening to the language of the wind, the intricate patterns of the furs he wore, stitched with a skill that bespoke patience, a single, weathered feather tucked into the band of his fur cap, its origin a mystery. One morning, she woke to find him gone, the fire banked low. A wave of desolation, surprisingly sharp, washed over her. Had he abandoned her? Was she alone again? Then she saw it, a small, crudely carved wooden bird placed on the rock beside her sleeping furs. Its form was simple, yet it captured the essence of flight, of freedom. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its smooth, unadorned lines. It was a message, she thought, though its meaning was elusive. Hope? A reminder of the world outside? When Cale returned, his arms laden with firewood, she was still holding the bird. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. No words were exchanged, but a fragile thread of understanding seemed to spool out between them in the quiet space. He simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, before turning to the fire. The silence in the shelter was no longer just an absence of sound, it was a space filled with unspoken things, with the slow, tentative mending of a shattered life. Ilara began to help in small ways. She refolded the furs, tidied the small collection of pots and tools. She learned to feed the fire, to keep it breathing. One day, Cale handed her a needle fashioned from bone and a length of sinew. He gestured to a tear in her own salvaged cloak. Her hands were clumsy at first, her fingers stiff and unaccustomed to the task, but she persisted. The simple act of mending, of repairing something broken, felt significant, a tiny act of reclamation. The memories of the massacre still came, but now, sometimes, they were interspersed with the image of Cale's steady presence, the sight of the small wooden bird, the feeling of warmth spreading through her. The snow still fell outside, but within their small haven, a different kind of stillness was taking root, one that held the faintest, most delicate promise of continuation. She was alive. That, in itself, was a nascent miracle. And she was not, entirely, alone. The days lengthened, infinitesimally at first, then with a more discernible stride, heralding a subtle shift in the season's harsh demeanor. The iron grip of winter began to loosen, ever so slightly. Patches of bare earth appeared where the snow receded, dark and damp, promising a resurgence of life that seemed almost impossible only weeks before. Ilara's strength returned slowly, a fragile vine taking root in barren soil. The deep ache in her bones lessened, replaced by the dull throb of healing muscles. She moved around the small shelter with more ease, her steps less hesitant. Cale began to lead her on short excursions outside, teaching her, through gesture and example, the ways of this starkly beautiful, yet perilous land. He showed her which plants were edible, which berries, though shriveled, still held nourishment, and which tracks belonged to which creatures. He taught her to listen, truly listen, to the whispers of the wind, the crackle of unseen movement in the undergrowth, the distant call of a hawk. His words were few, often single syllables or short, guttural sounds that seemed to mimic the noises of the wild itself. There, he would grunt, pointing to a nearly invisible snare. Wait, his patience was immense, his movements precise. Ilara was a keen observer, driven by the raw instinct for survival that had been reawakened within her. She learned to read the subtle signs of the changing weather in the cloud formations, to anticipate the direction of the wind. She began to feel a connection, however tenuous, to this land that had almost been her grave, a land that Cale navigated with such innate understanding. Yet, an undercurrent of unease always flowed beneath the surface of their quiet routines. The shadow of the pursuers, the men who had decimated her village, loomed large in Ilara's mind, a constant, silent threat. She knew they would not simply assume all were dead. They would hunt for witnesses, for any loose ends. The thought sent a cold dread through her, a fear distinct from the terror of the massacre itself. This was the fear of the hunted. Cale, too, was more watchful than usual. His gaze often swept the horizon, his stillness taking on a sharper edge. One evening, as dusk bled purple and grey across the snow-streaked hills, he returned to the shelter later than usual. His face was grim, his movements tense. He carried nothing from a hunt. In his hand, he held a strip of dark, oiled leather, clearly part of a horse's tack, freshly discarded. He dropped it onto the packed earth floor without a word. Ilara stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. It was new, well maintained. Not the possession of a solitary trapper. It spoke of organized men, of riders. "They come," Cale said, his voice a low rumble, the first full sentence he had spoken to her in days that wasn't a simple instruction. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. The phantoms of her nightmares were taking on a terrifying solidity. "How many?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Cale held up 3 fingers, then, after a pause, added a 4th. "For riders." Against his one. Against her, still far from her full strength. He looked at her then, his eyes holding a question she could not decipher. Was it doubt? A warning? He began to move with swift, purposeful efficiency, checking his sparse collection of weapons, his knife, his bow, the few arrows he possessed, each one precious. He handed Ilara a small, sharply pointed stone flake he had been working on, its edges keen. "Keep," he said. It was not a weapon for a warrior, but it was something. Something to hold, something to fight with if the worst came to pass. A spark of defiance ignited within Ilara, overriding the initial wave of fear. She would not be a helpless victim again. She had seen too much, lost too much, to simply surrender. She clutched the stone flake, its cold sharpness a tangible reality in her palm. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier now. He gestured to their few belongings, a silent command to gather them. They could not stay. This small haven, which had offered her life and a measure of peace, was no longer safe. The thought of returning to the open, of being exposed and vulnerable, was daunting. But the alternative, waiting for the pursuers to find them, was unthinkable. As they prepared to leave, a subtle shift occurred in their dynamic. Ilara was no longer just the rescued, the patient. She moved with a newfound purpose, her actions mirroring Cale's efficiency, albeit on a smaller scale. She doused the fire carefully, scattered the ashes, helped pack the meager supplies into 2 bundles. She was learning, adapting, becoming. The wooden bird Cale had carved for her, she tucked securely into a fold of her cloak. It was a small, fragile symbol of hope, but also of the quiet strength she was discovering within herself. The moon was a sliver in the dark sky as they slipped out of the shelter, 2 shadows moving through the greater darkness. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth, and perhaps, Ilara imagined, the faint, metallic scent of danger. Cale moved ahead, his form blending seamlessly with the night, Ilara following close behind, the stone flake clutched tightly in her hand. The hunt was on, but this time, she was not merely the hunted. She was part of the evasion, a participant in their shared struggle for survival. The forest around them was alive with unseen movement, with the ancient, watchful spirits of the wild. And somewhere, out in that same darkness, were the men who sought to extinguish the last spark of her past. The silence between her and Cale was no longer just of caution, it was the silence of allies, bound by circumstance and an unspoken pact. The cold stone in her hand felt like an extension of her will, a promise to herself that she would not fall without a fight. They moved through the pre-dawn gloom like phantoms, Cale leading the way, his senses preternaturally alert to every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. Ilara followed, her breathing measured, her focus absolute. The stone flake, now tucked into her belt, was a cold point of pressure, a constant reminder of the precipice upon which they stood. The pursuers were relentless, their presence a palpable weight on the air. Twice, Cale had changed their direction abruptly, his head tilted as if listening to whispers Ilara could not hear. He found faint signs of their passage, a freshly broken branch, the disturbed earth where a horse had stumbled. They were close. Too close. Cale led them to a narrow ravine, its walls steep and rocky, choked with dense brush and fallen trees. It offered concealment but also the risk of being trapped. He paused at the entrance, his gaze sweeping the area, then nodded curtly. Here, he breathed, the single word carrying the weight of decision. They scrambled down the loose scree, the sounds muffled by the thick vegetation. Cale found a small alcove, hidden behind a curtain of ancient ivy, barely large enough for them to crouch in. From this vantage point, they had a limited view of one of the ravine's narrow trails. The wait was agonizing. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps, every bird call like a signal. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. She clutched the sharpened stone, her knuckles white. She thought of her village, of the flames, of the faces of those she had lost. The grief was a cold, hard knot in her chest, but intertwined with it now was a fierce, burning anger. Cale remained utterly still, a part of the rock and shadow. Only the slight flare of his nostrils, the subtle tension in his jaw, betrayed his heightened state of awareness. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. The sun climbed, casting dappled light through the canopy above, but no warmth reached their hiding place. Then, a sound. Distinct. The clink of metal on stone, the snort of a horse. Ilara froze. Cale's hand shot out, not touching her, but hovering near her arm, a silent command to remain absolutely still. 3 riders appeared on the trail below, their figures dark and menacing. They moved with an arrogant confidence, their voices, when they spoke, harsh and grating. They were scanning the ravine, their eyes missing the small crevice where Cale and Ilara were hidden. One of them, burly and bearded, spat on the ground. "Nothing here," he grumbled. "The bitch probably froze to death weeks ago. Or wolves got her." Another, leaner, with cruel eyes, scanned the higher rocks. "The boss wants proof." "No witnesses." "She saw our faces." Ilara's blood ran cold. They knew she was alive. They were hunting her specifically. A 4th rider, who seemed to be their leader, reined in his horse slightly behind the others. He was older, his face a roadmap of harsh experiences, his eyes cold and calculating. He said nothing, merely surveyed the ravine with a chilling intensity. He seemed to sense something, his head turning slowly, methodically. His gaze swept past their hiding place, lingered for a heart-stopping moment, then moved on. Ilara held her breath, the stone in her hand digging into her palm. Just as they were about to move on, a small pebble, dislodged by Ilara's trembling foot, skittered down the rock face, landing with a soft click on the trail below. It was a tiny sound, almost insignificant, but in the charged silence, it was like a thunderclap. The leader's head snapped back. His eyes, like chips of ice, fixed on the area from where the sound had come. "There," he hissed. The 3 riders dismounted, drawing their weapons, crude swords and heavy axes. They began to advance towards the ivy-covered alcove. There was no more time for hiding. Cale exploded from the alcove with the sudden, lethal grace of a panther. His bow was already drawn, an arrow narked. The first arrow took the leanest rider in the throat before he could even raise his axe. He gurgled, clutching his neck, and fell. Cale dropped the bow and drew his knife, a fluid, unbroken motion. He met the bearded man's charge, deflecting a clumsy sword thrust, his knife darting in like a viper, finding a gap in the man's rough leather jerkin. The man roared, stumbling back, his sword clattering to the ground. Ilara, propelled by a surge of adrenaline that eclipsed her fear, scrambled out of the alcove. She saw the 3rd rider, momentarily distracted by Cale's furious assault, turning towards their hiding spot. He was between her and Cale. This was her moment. Her chance. Screaming a sound that was more animalistic than human, a raw cry of defiance and rage, she launched herself at him. She was smaller, weaker, but her attack was fueled by desperation. She drove the sharpened stone flake into his exposed side, the impact jarring her arm. He howled in pain and surprise, swatting at her as if she were an annoying insect. He backhanded her, sending her sprawling. But her attack, however desperate, had created an opening. Cale, having dispatched the bearded man, whirled. The leader, still mounted, cursed and drew a heavy pistol from his belt, aiming it towards Cale. Elara saw the movement. "Cale!" she screamed, scrambling to her feet. The rider Cale was fighting, though wounded by Elara, lunged at him. Cale sidestepped, his knife flashing again. But the distraction gave the leader the moment he needed. The pistol roared, smoke and flame belching from its muzzle. Cale cried out, stumbling, clutching his shoulder. Elara saw red. The leader was reloading, his cold eyes fixed on Cale. Without thinking, driven by a primal urge to protect the man who had saved her, she grabbed a heavy branch, a piece of fallen deadwood, and charged the mounted leader. He saw her coming, a sneer twisting his lips, raising the pistol again. She didn't hesitate. She swung the branch with all her might, aiming for the horse, for anything that would disrupt his aim. The branch connected with the horse's flank. The animal reared, screaming in pain and terror, unseating the leader, who tumbled to the ground, the pistol flying from his grasp. Elara was on him in an instant, the branch raised. But before she could strike, Cale, blood streaming from his shoulder, was there. His face was a mask of cold fury. He kicked the fallen pistol away, then hauled the dazed leader to his feet. Their eyes locked, the ruthless pursuer and the stoic protector. No words were spoken. Cale's knife moved, swift and final. Silence descended upon the ravine, broken only by the ragged gasps of Elara and Cale, and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead. The immediate threat was gone. The bodies of the pursuers lay still on the blood-soaked ground. Elara looked at her hands, trembling, one still clutching the stone flake, now stained crimson. She had fought. She had drawn blood. She had helped to save Cale. A profound exhaustion washed over her, but beneath it, something new and powerful was stirring, a fierce, undeniable sense of her own agency. The aftermath hung heavy in the ravine, the scent of blood and gunpowder acrid in the still air. Elara stared at the fallen men, their faces slack in death, no longer the terrifying phantoms of her nightmares but merely broken bodies. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down, her gaze drawn to Cale. He leaned against the rock wall, his face pale, his left arm pressed tightly against his bleeding shoulder. The front of his tunic was dark with blood. She rushed to his side, her earlier fear replaced by a sharp, urgent concern. "Cale," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're hurt." He met her gaze, his eyes clouded with pain but still holding that familiar, unyielding strength. He gave a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the obvious. "Flesh," he managed, his voice raspy. Bullet past. Elara helped him sit, her hand surprisingly steady as she gently pulled away the torn fabric of his tunic to inspect the wound. It was ugly, bleeding freely, but as he'd said, the ball seemed to have gone clean through the muscle of his shoulder, missing bone. Relief, potent and sharp, warred with the lingering shock of the confrontation. They needed to tend to it, quickly. Working together, a grim, unspoken understanding passing between them, they used strips of cloth torn from Elara's salvaged cloak and Cale's own spare garments to clean and bind the wound. Elara's touch, though untutored, was surprisingly gentle, her movements economical, echoing the way he had once cared for her. He bore the pain with stoic silence, only a tightening of his jaw betraying the intensity of it. When they were done, the makeshift bandage was crude but tight. Cale leaned back, his breathing shallow. Elara sat beside him, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving her feeling hollowed out, yet strangely centered. The silence that settled between them was different now. It was not the silence of caution or grief, but the profound quiet that follows a shared ordeal, a silence heavy with unspoken gratitude and the forging of an unbreakable bond. Cale looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze lingering on the smudges of dirt and blood on her face, the fierce light that still burned in her eyes. He saw not the helpless victim he had pulled from the snow, but a woman who had faced death and chosen to fight, a woman who had, in her own way, saved him. Slowly, he reached out his uninjured hand, not to touch her, but to retrieve the stone flake that had fallen from her grasp. He picked it up, examined its crimson-stained edge, then looked back at her. He didn't offer it back. Instead, his gaze shifted to the fallen leader's pistol, lying discarded on the ground. After a moment, he gestured towards it with his chin. "Yours," he said, his voice still rough. Elara stared at the weapon, then at Cale. It was a significant offering. A tool of death, yes, but also a symbol of power, of self-defense. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, her will to survive, her place as an equal in this harsh world. She hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. It felt heavy in her hand, cold and unfamiliar, yet empowering. She didn't know how to use it, not yet, but she would learn. The ravine, once a place of ambush and terror, now felt like a crucible. Something had been burned away here, her last vestiges of victimhood, perhaps. And something new had been forged in its place. They could not stay. The bodies would eventually be found. Cale, despite his wound, knew they had to move. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, and Elara was there to steady him. They gathered what little they had, Cale now leaning on her for support as much as she had once leaned on him. As they prepared to leave the shadowed confines of the ravine, Elara paused. She looked back at the scene of the conflict, at the grim tableau of death. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a somber understanding of the price of survival. Then, she turned her face towards the light filtering down from above, towards the unknown path ahead. Cale was waiting, his eyes on her. He offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of readiness, of shared purpose. They climbed out of the ravine, emerging into the pale afternoon sun. The world seemed different, sharper, the colors more vivid. The wind still whispered through the trees, but its voice no longer seemed solely mournful. There was a resilience in its sigh, a promise of endurance. Elara walked beside Cale, the pistol now tucked securely in her belt, a counterpoint to the small wooden bird she still carried in her cloak. They moved slowly, Cale conserving his strength, Elara watchful and alert, her senses heightened. They did not speak of where they were going. There was no clear destination, no map to guide them. But for the first time since the ashes of her old life had grown cold, Elara felt a flicker of something akin to hope, or perhaps, more accurately, a profound and unshakable will to continue. The vast wilderness stretched before them, still indifferent, still challenging. But they faced it together, two solitary figures bound by shared hardship and a silent, powerful alliance. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was filled with the weight of all they had endured, and the quiet strength of all they had become. They were survivors, yes, but they were also architects of their own uncertain future, walking forward, one step at a time, into the dawning light of a new, unwritten day. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, colors that mirrored the violence they had escaped and the fierce beauty of the world they now navigated. Cale's wound, though painful, was not festering. Elara had learned from his earlier ministrations, cleaning it with boiled water and crushed herbs he'd indicated, her touch becoming more confident with each passing day. They found shelter in a shallow cave, high on a rocky outcrop, offering a defensible position and a sweeping view of the valley below. The fire they built was small, smokeless, Cale's ingrained caution dictating every action. He taught her how to bank it, how to read the wind for any telltale signs of its scent carrying too far. Elara, in turn, proved a quick study, her mind, once clouded by grief and fear, now sharp and focused on the myriad details of survival. She learned to set snares, her fingers growing nimble despite the cold. She learned to identify the edible roots Cale pointed out, to track small game, to move with a silence that rivaled his own. The pistol Cale had given her remained a constant presence at her belt. He showed her, with painstaking patience and minimal words, how to load it, how to aim, how to clean it. The first time she fired it, the recoil jarring her arm, the sound echoing across the desolate landscape, a grim satisfaction settled within her. It was a language of power she was slowly beginning to understand. Their dialogue remained sparse, yet the spaces between words were filled with a growing depth of communication. A shared glance across the fire, a nod of understanding, the silent offering of a roasted piece of meat, these became their lexicon. Cale would sometimes watch her as she practiced with the pistol, or as she meticulously stitched a patch onto her worn cloak, his expression unreadable but for a faint softening around his eyes. He saw the transformation, the steel that had been forged in the heart of the vulnerable woman he had found in the snow. He, too, was changing. The rigid shell of his solitude, built over years of loss and isolation, was showing hairline cracks. Her presence, her resilience, her quiet determination, had become a steady point in his otherwise solitary existence. He found himself listening for her footsteps, for the sound of her breathing as she slept. He had saved her life, but in doing so, she had, in some indefinable way, brought a flicker of warmth back into his own frozen world. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the vast, star-dusted sky arching above them, Ilara traced the outline of the small wooden bird Cale had carved for her. She looked up at him, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft, breaking the comfortable silence. "Why did you help me?" Cale stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames reflecting in his twilight eyes. He picked up a stick, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened by disuse and memory. "Sought a life," he said, the word spare, yet resonant. "Small." Fighting, he paused, then added, so quietly she almost didn't hear, like her he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Ilara understood. He carried his own ghosts, his own lost flock. In saving her, perhaps he was trying to save a part of himself, to honor a memory too painful to voice. A profound sense of connection settled between them, deeper than words, stronger than the harshest winter wind. They were two solitary souls, scarred by the cruelty of the world, who had found in each other an anchor, a reason to keep walking, to keep fighting. The future remained an unmapped territory, fraught with peril and uncertainty. The wilderness was still a formidable adversary, and the world beyond it, the world of men and their endless conflicts, was perhaps even more dangerous. But they would face it. Together. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold, Ilara stood at the mouth of the cave, looking out at the awakening world. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a new day. Cale came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. They didn't speak, merely watched as the sun climbed, banishing the shadows, illuminating the vast, untamed landscape that was now their home, their proving ground. She was no longer Ilara, the sole survivor of a forgotten massacre. He was no longer just Cale, the lone hunter. They were something more, forged in the crucible of shared hardship, bound by an unspoken covenant of mutual protection and respect. They were a new beginning, a tiny, defiant spark of hope in a world that often seemed determined to extinguish it. Their story was not one of grand heroism or epic battles, but of the quiet courage it takes to endure, to adapt, to find connection in the face of desolation. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the enduring power of a single, stubborn breath in the snow. What choices define us when faced with the abyss? Is it the instinct to survive, or the impulse to reach out a hand to another who has fallen? Perhaps, in the end, they are one and the same, two sides of a coin minted in the fires of adversity. The wilderness holds its secrets close, but sometimes, if you listen carefully, it whispers tales of such improbable alliances, of lives reclaimed from the ashes, of paths that converge in the deepest snow, leading not to an end, but to an unforeseen, shared horizon. Tell us, what would you have done in that moment of discovery, faced with a life hanging by a thread in a world so determined to break it? Share your thoughts in the comments below.